Are we ready? We are. Okay. Welcome back to our first Author's Corner since the COVID pandemic began. Thank you to Dick Haley from Haley Booksellers for organizing this evening's event. He has books available for purchase, both the one that Bill Martin will be speaking of and some of his earlier works, and you may have them signed after the book talk. Tonight is even more special because Melrose's own Jane Healey is here to introduce William Martin. I'm sure you all know Jane as the best-selling author of 3 historical fiction novels, The Saturday Evening Girls Club, The Beantown Girls, and The Secret Stealer. Without further ado, I give you Jane Healey.
Thank you, Diane. Hooray for in-person book events again. This is so amazing, and I feel like we are blessed to have one of the best in New England and one of the best of the historical genre, in my opinion. New York Times bestselling author William Martin. He is the author of 12 novels. I had to double check that, make sure I got the number right. He's a winner of numerous awards, including the Robert P. Parker Award and the New England Book Award. One of the perks of being a published author is being able to read novels well in advance of when they come out. And so I got to read this book almost a year ago, December 41, and I can't say enough about how much I enjoyed it. I loved it. I think it's a great beach read. I think it's a great book club read. And it has a little bit of an old Hollywood vibe, I would say, with a nod to, I could think of LA Confidential when I was reading it, and Murder on the Orient Express. So without further ado, I will let Bill tell you more about it. Welcome, William Martin. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Jane. It's great to be here, and great to be introduced by you, a rising star. I'm just an old pro, playing out the string. But I did have the honor of reading Beantown Girls before it came out, and getting to say something nice about it that they put right on the back of the book. And so Jane returned the favor. December 41 is the ultimate page turner. I loved it. Direct quote from her in print. I'm going to stop banging. Every novel has a different genesis. Sometimes, I'm just looking over at Back Bay and Cape Cod over there, sometimes a book begins in the dim, distant past of your childhood. Back Bay is that kind of book. When I was in the 4th grade at the Robert Gould Shaw School in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, I heard the story from Miss Houghton of how the city of Boston was built. It had begun as a kind of a fist-shaped peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land called the Neck, where Washington Street is now. And then they had filled both sides, the south end, the Fort Point Channel, the Back Bay, in a layer of sand and gravel 20 feet deep. And she told us way back in the 4th grade that you could dig down into the basements of those fine old mansions that they built on top of that landfill, and down in the mud you might find a dump, a trash dump, where they had thrown out crockery and silverware and other things that were trash to people in the early 19th century, but would be treasures to archaeologists today in 1959. And I filed that story away because I thought to myself, what if there was real buried treasure down there? And when the wolf was at the door in 1975 or 76, I had graduated from the USC Film School and wrote screenplays that nobody wanted to produce. I dusted that story off. I reached way back into the past and came up with that story of treasure lost in a Boston landfill. Other novels may come to you just by writing down an opening line. I was stumped once, sitting there saying, what's my next book going to be? And so I started jotting down opening lines. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Sounded too familiar. Call me Ishmael. Well, who would name a main character Ishmael in a novel? And then I wrote down the opening lines of Catholic confession, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. The response is, of course, how long has it been since your last confession? And the priest hears the words, 6 weeks and 3 days. This is a signal. A penitent has arrived in the what we knew as the German church on Shawmut Avenue in the south end of Boston. He has come to raise a cache of weapons with money that the priest has been collecting and run those guns back to Ireland. That became The Rising of the Moon. This book came to life in a movie theater. I was watching the movie Darkest Hour with Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill, and you've probably seen it. There's a scene where Churchill sits down in the basement of his headquarters. He's on the telephone to FDR, trying to persuade FDR to give him some help, any kind of help. France is falling, the Germans are advancing on Dunkirk, the flotilla has not yet crossed the channel to rescue them, the British Expeditionary Force. And Roosevelt says to Churchill, I can't help you, my hands are tied by American politics. And they hang up, and Churchill slumps in despair. And as I watched that scene, and I watched the camera cut to a long shot, I thought to myself, in 18 months, those two men, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, will stand on the south portico of the White House to express their unity as allies and to light the national community Christmas tree. They will then give speeches that, in the case of the Churchill speech, will echo down the ages to us. And what a target they will make. Right then I thought, I've got a novel. A German assassin's going to try to take a shot at them. At the beginning of World War II, what could be more spectacular? And I was off and running. Told my wife about it over dinner after the movie, and she liked the idea. She always likes ideas in which the research will require us to go to cities where our kids live. And we have a son in Berkeley, California, and we have a son in Los Angeles. And the book is going to begin in Los Angeles. And it's going to begin on December 8th. One of the fundamental questions that we always ask ourselves as writers, well, it's a series of fundamental questions. What does the main character want? Who stands in their way? Why here and why now? Why December 8th? Well, think of what December 8th is all about in the history of humanity, not just the history of the United States. When I started imagining how the book would begin, I saw myself as a newsreel camera traveling around the globe. You know, you saw those famous old newsreels where you'd see the globe at the beginning, news of the world, and the globe would spin. Well, start out there at the international dateline in the far Pacific, the place that divides yesterday from today. It's 2 a.m. as the camera crosses the international dateline. It's December 8th. The camera comes down into Tokyo, where the Japanese foreign minister is handing to the emperor at 2 a.m. a sheet of paper, explaining to the emperor that this sheet of paper, a copy of this, will be handed to the United States Secretary of State in 30 minutes, and suspending diplomatic relations, and in 90 minutes, the bombs will start falling on Pearl Harbor. The Emperor approves. Our camera picks up and starts traveling across the vast and empty canvas of Asian Russia. Trains are speeding toward the west. Trains carrying 30 divisions of Siberian troops who are being thrown into the battle just to the west of Moscow. The camera passes over Moscow, over those front lines where the battle is raging between the Russians and the Germans, the most cataclysmic clash of arms perhaps in human history. And the camera keeps traveling. It travels over East Prussia, down into a dank pine, reputed to be Al Capone's limousine. Of course, the Department of the Treasury was in control of the Secret Service. The Department of the Treasury had confiscated Capone's limousine along with a lot of other things when they arrested him for income tax evasion. And since the president was waiting for his armored limousines to be completed in Detroit, they put him into this car. And they headed up the hill, or up the street toward Capitol Hill. Now, Washington, D.C. on the morning of December 8, 1941 was as tense as it had been since Abraham Lincoln headed to his first inaugural in March of 1861. 6 Secret Service agents, 3 on each side, rode with the president. Even though it was a dank, cold, miserable day, none of them wore overcoats. They wore only their sport coats, because if something went wrong and they had to react quickly, it would be a lot easier in a sport or jacket than in an overcoat. U.S. military soldiers lined Pennsylvania Avenue, one after another, every 4 feet. There was a crowd, and they were very silent, and there wasn't a lot of waving out the window by FDR. The manhole covers on Pennsylvania Avenue had all been inspected and welded shut. The president was driven up to the Capitol, into the entrance that was reserved just for him, a place where he could be surreptitiously moved from car to wheelchair without anyone seeing. And it is an astonishing fact to us today that the American news media never took a picture of him when he was halfway in and halfway out of a car. There is almost no footage of him walking, as I've just described, with help. It's only when he stops and stands that the cameras would start to roll. Anyway, he arrives in the House of, in the office of the Speaker of the House, and that's where the book begins. Let me read to you a little bit of it. It was the largest radio audience in history. On the cold coast of Maine, they were listening. Down on Wall Street, trading stopped so they could listen. On assembly lines in Detroit, they were taking long lunches so the auto workers could listen. In Chicago, the butchers stopped slaughtering in the stockyards to listen. In Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, where they grew corn and wheat enough to feed the world, now that the rains had returned and the dust had stopped blowing, the farmers were listening there too. In all the places where the muscle and sinew of America bound one state or town or family to another, they were listening for the warm baritone and patrician inflections that somehow never sounded too upper crusty coming out of the radio. Because America had awakened that morning to the cold reality of war. War in every time zone. War encircling the earth. War once more as the original human fact. In Hawaii, U.S. Navy battleships burned beneath great funerary clouds of black oil smoke. In the far Pacific, Japanese troops attacked along every line of latitude and longitude. In swirling blizzards of blood and snow, Russians and Germans slaughtered each other before Moscow. Across Europe, jackboots echoed and resistance guttered while U-boats stalked freighters on the roiling gray Atlantic. But Americans were listening, because Franklin Roosevelt was about to make sense of it all. In Washington, the CBS radio announcer was describing the packed House chamber, the tense atmosphere, when suddenly his voice rose. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the president is appearing and moving toward the podium. And from out of deep bass consoles and tinny tabletop radios in every corner of the country, a roar exploded. Something between a cheer and an angry shout. The harsh, hard, ferocious cry of Americans lifting themselves from shock and drawing strength from the president, who lifted himself from a wheelchair and by remarkable force of will was appearing upright before them. When the roar receded, the speaker introduced the president. More cheers and shouts. Then Roosevelt's voice rang out, firm, confident, indignant. Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. In the West, radio stations had gone off the air the night before, so that Japanese bombers couldn't home in on the broadcasts. But now Roosevelt's voice rolled across deserts, up and over mountain ranges, and down into the warm green dream of Southern California. Down along boulevards laid like gridwork atop lettuce fields and orange groves. Down onto long, straight, relentless thoroughfares that ended where scrub-covered hillsides leapt up to define and divide the expanse of Los Angeles. Down into offices and coffee shops and cars where people were listening, unaware that as Roosevelt spoke, a Nazi assassin was shooting at targets in a local canyon and planning the most daring act of the age. Unaware also that before it was over, he would draw many of them into his dark orbit. I guarantee you, after you read that, you will have to read the next section, and the next section, and the next, and the one on after that. But why am I headed to Los Angeles? Well, I was drawn to write about Los Angeles in the 40s for a lot of reasons. But first of all, as I was talking about the big picture process of developing a novel, well, once you get that novel started, whether it's because of a deep, long-held desire to write something, or that instant insight in a movie theater, you'll suddenly find your brain shooting little darts of information at you, saying, hey, remember this? Oh, you need to use this. Remember this? And I had read an article some years ago, I think it might have been in Smithsonian or some other magazine, about a Nazi compound that you can still visit in Los Angeles if you know where to look. You drive way out Sunset Boulevard, not the Sunset in Hollywood, but farther and farther out through Westwood, past UCLA, and on out to Pacific Palisades. And when you get to the Riviera Country Club on your left, take a right and drive up the hill, up past big Hollywood-style mansions. Spielberg lives up there somewhere. When you get to the top, you'll drive around onto a fire road. Then you will drive along that fire road, and you will look down into a canyon that's now about 300 feet deep, and then rockets up this way on the other side up onto the Will Rogers State Park. And you'll come finally to chain link fence, a chain link fence that still stands, that surrounds 55 acres of land that a group of neo-fascists in 1933, right after Hitler became chancellor, purchased from the Will Rogers estate, 55 acres. They fenced it all in, and they pumped $1 million worth of labor into the construction of power plants, fuel tanks, terraces for gardens, all of which you can still see, 2 long concrete stairways, and they engaged an architect who designed for them a 40-room mansion. The plans can still be seen at UCLA in the archives. A 40-room mansion that many people believed then and now was to have been Hitler's Western White House. They called this place the Murphy Ranch, but there was no Murphy, and it ain't no ranch. And you can still visit it, and it is a very creepy place. And I said, I'm going to begin a novel here. And I said that before I'd gotten this idea. And once I had the idea, it was ready-made. There is a German assassin, and this assassin is hiding out in the fascist community in Los Angeles, and there sure was a fascist community in Los Angeles. And the FBI is going to raid that compound when he's down there, and they're going to arrest everybody down there, as the FBI did on December 8th. They first started with the Japanese. They arrested about 250 Japanese before the morning was out, and then they turned on the Germans and arrested 60 or 80 of them. The Japanese they sent to an internment camp right there in Griffith Park. The Germans were all sent to a federal holding pen on Terminal Island. All of that will appear in the book. But who were all these Nazis who were down there? Well, Los Angeles had a Bund Hall, a German-American Bund that had started off as the Friends of the New Germany in the early 30s, and over the years had morphed into this group that built a Bund Hall at Figueroa and 15th Street. Anybody like NBA basketball? You've watched the Lakers play in the Staples Center? Well, if you could transport your mind back to the 1940s, you would see a Bund Hall sitting right in the middle of what is now the basketball court at the Staples Center. The Staples Center was built over the land on which this had once stood. A large building. You could walk in, and to your left was the Aryan bookstore, where you could buy German travel books, German cookbooks, all the anti-Semitic literature you could look for, you could ask for. And to your right was the Gaststube, the restaurant, where you could have Schweinehaxe and Wiener Schnitzel and all those other delicious things. And on the wall, there was a map with little red pushpins tracing the movement of the German army across Russia. And directly opposite, at the main feature of this particular building, a large auditorium with a stage in which they celebrated events such as Adolf Hitler's birthday, with large photographs of the pasty-faced Fuhrer and swastika flags and all of the rest of it. Right there in Tinseltown, right there in the place where not only did they invent the American dream and put it up on the silver screen, a lot of people lived it too. All of it was going on right under their noses in Hollywood. And these guys in these bunds, many of them were Germans, some of them were first generation Americans. They were in contact with German agents across the country. They would go to Long Beach. Whenever a German ship would put in down in Long Beach, there would be Gestapo agents aboard. And the Gestapo agents would be carrying cash. They would be carrying literature that these guys would spread around. The cash would be used for various nefarious activities, such as, trying to persuade disgruntled American military veterans of the sort who had joined in the Bonus March in the 1920s, persuading these guys to start stealing weapons from the armories. Many of them were members of the National Guard. Steal enough weapons from the armories, we can arm a small army that can rise up in California, rise up and take control in California and inspire fascist movements all the way across the country. They also posited the possibility of arresting on some bright sunny California morning Harry Cohn, Jack L. Warner, Samuel Goldwyn, a few of the other Jewish movie executives, kidnapping them, taking them all up to a place called Hindenburg Park up above Los Angeles, and hanging them all. they really did discuss these things. These guys were bonkers, but they were very dangerous as well. They had bouncers, they had brown shirts. Even though they wore a white shirt, they still wore the Sam Brown belt and the jodhpur pants, and they trained, and they had some very dangerous sergeants at arms in these organizations. There was a lot going on. One of the most successful things they did on a regular basis was to sneak down to Hollywood and Vine, climb up onto a building and start throwing anti-Semitic literature, paper, out over the audience. They called it Snowstorm. So, out of an ocean of fascism could rise a single assassin. He could hide out, he could dive, disappear when he had to, and remain afloat because of the money that was coming in through the Bund from the Gestapo. All of this stuff has the possibility of happening. I had to persuade myself from the very beginning that it could happen so that I could persuade you. Because I'm not giving anything away when I say FDR and Churchill are going to live through this book. If you've read any of my books, you know that my characters never change history. I don't change history. The characters don't change history. The characters will be changed by history and by their encounter with it. And in order for me to satisfy myself that this could have happened, I dug up a book, a very rare autobiography called Riley of the White House. It was written in 1946 by a man named Mike Riley, who had been FDR's anchorman. That's what they called him, as the #1 Secret Service agent. He was the man who was always at FDR's elbow, because a president who could not walk was even more vulnerable. And if something went wrong, Mike Riley had to be right at his elbow to pick him up and run like hell. And Riley wrote, after the war, about that first couple of weeks and about how nervous they were. The Army, and they had some hand in protecting the president, they were worried about German paramilitaries, a big group of guys, making a move on the White House. So the Army had machine guns up on the roof. The Secret Service was worried, first of all, about the vulnerability of the White House, and they were suggesting things like painting the skylights, painting the whole White House, stopping the president from ever having a fire in a fireplace, things like that. But Riley was worried, as he wrote, about the lone assassin or the small team dispatched to kill the president. And when I read that, I said, okay, I can move forward with this. If it was a concern in the minds of the people who were protecting the president, I think it's fair of me to have that moment when an assassin looks through that gun sight on Christmas Eve. Because that's when all this is going to come to an end, Christmas Eve. That's when they light the national Christmas tree. But there's another reason why I wanted to start this book on December 8th. Not only is it a significant moment in world history, it is a very significant moment in the history of American popular culture. And the book being set in Hollywood, the first third of it anyway, the first third's in Hollywood, the second third is on the Super Chief and on the roads, heading east to Washington, and the final third is in Washington, D.C. On December 8th, 1941, at Warner Brothers, a pile of scripts and plays which had just arrived from New York were dropped on the table in the story department, where the young readers who worked for $1.12 an hour reading material and then giving their opinions on it, where a pile was dropped on the table, including a play called Everybody Comes to Rick's. That very day, you know what it was, Casablanca. And I happen to love Casablanca. I love the shimmering black and white and the camera movements of Michael Curtiz in the studio and the casting and the story itself. And I knew when I started writing this that I wasn't going to try to write some kind of parallel to Casablanca. There's a small love triangle in this book that gets dispensed with fairly early, but there are ideas in Casablanca that I tried to layer into this novel. It is a novel about one very, very efficient and nasty guy who will be stopped ultimately, and yes, he will be stopped, who will be stopped ultimately by dogged Americans who step away from their own lives in order to embrace the challenge of what 1941 brings to Americans everywhere. And the line in Casablanca that stuck in my head throughout the whole writing of the book was the line that comes in the scene right after Bogart meets Ilsa, Ingrid Bergman, for the first time. It's later that night. He's sitting there with the bottle of bourbon, and Sam is in the background tinkling at the piano, and Bogey has had a drink or two, and he says, "Sam, it's December 1941 in Casablanca. What time is it in New York?" Sam says, I don't know, my watch has stopped. And Bogey says, "I bet they're asleep in New York. I bet they're asleep all over America." And this book is going to show Americans waking up from being asleep. It's going to show them rising up and finding the spine that the Germans and most adversaries that we have ever run into don't think we'll find. And they are always surprised by the end result. You know, Hitler had a very low opinion of the United States. In fact, on December 11th, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, while the world's expectations were sort of hanging in the balance, will America declare war on Germany, or will America turn entirely on the Japanese? And Roosevelt was sitting there playing the quiet game on the night of Tuesday, December 9th. He gave a fireside chat in which he said it would ill behoove the United States were we to defeat Imperial Japan only to turn around and find that Nazi Germany and Italy were in control of the rest of the world. He was leading us in the direction of fighting the Germans. And Churchill desperately wanted him to focus on Germany first. So desperately, in fact, that the minute Pearl Harbor had happened, Churchill began to make plans to get over here and get into Roosevelt's ear. Roosevelt held him off for a couple of days and then finally said, "Okay, you can come." Churchill said, "I'm coming on a battleship." He didn't want to fly because flying was fraught with difficulties and dangers, and the plane would have to land in Nova Scotia or up in the Maritimes, and he might be fogged in for a week. So he got on the battleship HMS Duke of York. They steamed across the Atlantic. It was a very hard crossing. He spent the whole time dosing himself with Mother Sill's seasick remedy. His staff, a couple of them ended up with broken bones. He entertained himself when he wasn't writing reports on the Pacific Theater and the European Theater and how they should be handled, reports that he immediately handed to FDR the first time they sat down in his office. He would entertain himself by reading C.S. Forester novels and watching movies. There's a story of him watching The Seahawk on Saturday night just before they arrived in the United States. The Seahawk with Errol Flynn and Claude Rains, and he ran it in the wardroom, and at the climactic moment when the English break out of the galley and take over the ship, he leaps up and says, "The English are winning, the English are winning." And he hurrying to the United States to make sure that he could make the English win in Europe as well. they got to the Chesapeake, the ship, HMS Duke of York, was supposed to steam up the Chesapeake, and then he was supposed to transfer to another vessel and go on up the Potomac to Washington. It was going to take him another day. He said, I have to get to Washington tonight. And he gets onto a small plane, flying with Tommy Thompson, his bodyguard, Lord Beaverbrook, one of his important aides, and his doctor, Lord Moran. And as Moran writes later, as the small plane flew up the Chesapeake, a flight of only about an hour from Norfolk to Washington, D.C., they were captivated by what they saw out the windows. They had arrived from a place that had been in blackout for almost 2 years. And now they're looking out on a country where the lights are all on and the cars are driving along. And Churchill turned to Tommy Thompson, who was on the other side, and he said, what do you think of this? And Tommy Thompson said, I see lights, but more than lights, I see freedom. And Churchill was quite moved by that. Lord Moran would write about it later. And then the plane would land at the Anacostia Naval Air Station, and standing, leaning against his limousine was Franklin Roosevelt, waiting for him. Lord Moran would later write of the moment and how they shake hands, and FDR gives one of those great cocks of his head to Churchill, who was wearing his little naval cap. And as Lord Moran would later say, FDR's presence is primarily that huge head and the way that he uses it, because he has no legs to speak of. Churchill always speaks of him as a man of such impressive presence, but he has no legs. They then drove to the White House, where FDR and Churchill started their conferences over drinks, and Churchill started his rather frosty relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt, who very quickly came to dislike him because he was a lousy house guest. The next morning, as Alonzo Fields writes, he was coming down the hallway in the family quarters, and Churchill was in one of the north bedrooms and poked his head out and said, Fields, come over here for a minute. Well, now, we had a very nice night last night, didn't we? Yes, sir. And we want to be friends, don't we? Yes, sir. And we want to leave as friends, don't we? Yes, sir. So I have a few things I need you to remember. First of all, I detest whistling in the hallway. Secondly, I don't want anybody talking outside my room. At breakfast, I shall require a tumbler of sherry with my meal. At lunch, 2 glasses of scotch and soda on my tray. And after dinner, 90-year-old French brandy and Pol Roger champagne. And the butler was nonplussed and said, yes, and just took off and did it all. Of course, Eleanor was very annoyed because FDR was a morning man and Churchill was a night owl. And FDR tried to stay up with him and match him drink for drink. And that would have been a tall order for anybody, matching Churchill drink for drink. And Eleanor finally put her foot down and told him, you have to start getting to bed at 11 o'clock. It's just not good for you to stay up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning discussing policy with him. So all of that brings us to Christmas Eve and to the moment when Churchill and FDR will stand together on the south portico of the White House to light the national Christmas tree in front of some 20,000 people who have been admitted through various security measures that I write about in the book and drew from the work of Mike Riley. 20,000 people on the lawn, more people back on the ellipse and in the distance, and of course, another enormous radio audience. And there are moments in the book where I describe the shows that have been preempted the soap operas that have been preempted in order to play this moment, one of the most solemn Christmases that the United States has ever experienced, as one of the CBS radio announcers states. All of that comes from the amazing trove of YouTube videos and audios that you can listen to just sitting at your desk. That's all been digitized by the National Archives and the Library of Congress. And being able to put that kind of thing into the book just brings it to life. But on that night, Churchill gets the final word. Here in the midst of war, raging and roaring over all the lands and seas, creeping nearer to our hearts and homes, here amid all the tumult, we have tonight the peace of the Spirit in each cottage home and in every generous heart. Therefore, we may cast aside, for this night at least, the cares and dangers which beset us, and make for the children an evening of happiness in a world of storm. Here then, for one night only, each home throughout the English-speaking world should be a brightly lighted island of happiness and peace. Now, he gets to give that speech because my characters have stopped that goddamn Nazi before he took the shot. However, when you get to that point in the book, and the Christmas carols are playing, and the important characters are lining up on the south portico of the White House, and the good guys and the bad guys are running around out there on the ellipse and around Constitution Avenue, when you get to that point, you're going to be saying, oh man, I hope this guy doesn't kill them. We're in such trouble if he does. And that means, if you feel that way, I did my job. And I guarantee you that I do. Thank you all for listening. Anybody have a question?
I have a question.
Yes.
How long did it take you to write?
How long did it take me? It took, well, I had hoped to be done 3 years ago, just like a week or so before my daughter's wedding, so I could have it all out of the house. But I had 6 weeks before her wedding, I was sitting at my desk, beating my head on the wall, saying, God damn it, I have 6 weeks to go and I have 6 months worth of work to do. How am I going to finish it? I don't know. And then I had a heart attack. And then I didn't give a damn anymore. And my editor took his foot off the gas and said, whatever you want to give it to us, Bill, I'm not going to put any pressure on you. So it ultimately took me 2.5 years. And then the publisher, because they have their schedules and I have mine, they held it. I had hoped to publish it, well, wouldn't you want to publish December 41 in December 21? But I missed that, so I said, okay, let's go for the summer. Let's make it a beach read. And as Dick Haley just said, this book will have legs all the way till Christmas. So the books always take me too long. And that's just been a fact of my life since the first one. And I suppose I could have another 4 or 5 books out there, but I'm not sure what the quality would be if I had driven myself to do that. And I'm not even sure if I'd be here if I had driven myself to do that. Because who knows, I might have had that heart attack 10 years earlier and then quit altogether. But the great thing about writing one of these books is that even if it takes you a long time, you get to live in a world that that becomes as real to you as this room. You know, every day when you probably know the same feeling, you go upstairs and you sit at the word processor and you say, turn it on, the time machine just came to life. And you're traveling into the past. And with this book, I would put on some Glenn Miller or some Artie Shaw and play that old music that I happen to love. People tell me I was born a generation too late. And I would just get back there and I'd watch the YouTube videos, or I'd watch scenes from those 1940s movies, because you'll find when you read this book that it's kind of infused with a sense of Hollywood storytelling from the 1940s. The characters, the dialogue, the locations, not only the locations in Los Angeles, but all of the other storytelling tropes that you'll just feel in this, the train ride with the villain and the hero on the train, and the unusual happenings that occur, and then the chase, the cat and mouse games that unfold in and around all of the great monuments of Washington, D.C. How many times did Hitchcock do that? And so I watched a lot of Hollywood movies from the 1940s, a lot of Bogart movies, and that's great research. That's really easy to do, and a lot of newsreels too. And if you're at all interested, I put together a historical timeline. It's on my website that gives you. It's on the first page of the website, and you'll see just a series of YouTube videos that give you a context for what the month of December of 1941 is like and is all about. Not only in world history, but also in American pop culture. What's the #1 song on December 6th, 1941? That's when the Billboard chart would come out every week. Chattanooga Choo Choo, Glenn Miller and the Orchestra, Paula Kelly and the Modernaires. Did I ever tell you I met Paula Kelly? She was an old family friend. Don knows a lot about music back there, and he's Paula Kelly and the Modernaires. That's right. Of course, my mother, Sinatra's in the book. His voice is in the book. He's not in the book. My mother claimed she was a vocalist in the 30s in Boston, and she sang on the radio. She had her own show. She sang with the local bands. Her father was a Boston cop, so there were the gossip pages. They said, "Stay away from that Louise Farley. You might think she's another Shantuzzi, but her father, the Boston cop, is in the back of the auditorium every night watching over her." My mother once claimed that she went to a vocal class in Scully Square off of Cambridge Street. A vocal teacher named Madame Shari DeLise, and this is way back. This is the 1930s, and so the class begins, and there are half a dozen people. And by the end of the class, Madame DeLise throws 2 people out of the class. She throws my mother out, and she throws out this skinny guy in a yellow sweater who's come up to visit his relatives in the North End. And they walk down the stairs together, and they get out on the sidewalk there on Cambridge Street in Scully Square. And my mother says, "Well, so what are you going to do now?" He says, "Well, I'm not going to pay any attention to that old bag. I'm going to keep singing. But from now on," wait for it, "I'm going to sing my way." And it was Frank Sinatra. My wife never believed that story, but I did. See, you guys, you hear me all the time, Dick and Don. You never heard that story before. But the whole idea is that the popular culture of that time infuses this book, and I had a great time researching it and doing cameos with Humphrey Bogart. John Wayne and Marlene Dietrich are seen having lunch after either they shot a scene or were a scene, because they were an item, believe it or not. John Wayne and Marlene Dietrich. John Huston's in it, a few other characters. Just little walkthroughs. So I hope you enjoy it, and tell all your friends, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
I'll be glad to sign any copies if anybody would like to purchase them.
If you have a telephone, it probably seems like illegal robocalls are out of control. I'm Katie Daffin, an attorney at the Federal Trade Commission. If you pick up the phone and hear a recorded message instead of a live person, that's a robocall. Consumers are getting more and more robocalls, and they are not happy about it. As the number of calls has multiplied, the number of complaints has too. The reason for the spike in robocalls has to do with technology. Companies are using auto dialers that can send out thousands of phone calls every minute for an incredibly low cost. What's important is that the companies that use this technology don't bother to screen for the numbers on the National Do Not Call Registry. If a company doesn't care about obeying the law, you can be sure they're trying to scam you. You've probably gotten robocalls about candidates running for office or charities asking for donations. These robocalls are allowed. But any robocall that's trying to sell you something probably is illegal, unless you've given your written permission to get calls from that company. The FTC has stopped billions, yes, billions of robocalls in the last 2 years. Tracing these calls is a tough job, and there are a few reasons for that. One is that many different companies use the same or very similar recorded messages. Another is that they fake the caller ID information that you see on your phone. That's called caller ID spoofing, and new technology makes it very easy to do. And a third is that the robocallers often place the calls through internet technology that hides their location. At the FTC, we're continuing our aggressive enforcement efforts, and we're also looking for innovative technological solutions to the robocall problem. For more information, please visit ftc.gov/robocalls. That's ftc.gov/robocalls.
Identity theft happens. It's an unfortunate fact of modern life. But there are certain steps you can take to help keep your personal information from falling into the wrong hands. Every day you do things to protect what's most important to you. And you know what? You do them almost automatically. Routine things like looking both ways before you cross, brushing your teeth, and buckling your seatbelt. Another routine to get into is keeping tabs on your identity and personal information. Here are 5 easy ways you can do it. Read your credit card and bank statements carefully and often. Know your payment due dates. If a bill doesn't show up when you expect it, look into it. Read the statements from your health insurance plan. Make sure the claims paid match the care you got. Shred any documents with personal and financial information. Review each of your 3 credit reports at least once a year. It's easy and it's free. And before you know it, protecting your personal information can be as routine as locking your doors at night. For more tips and tools on dealing with identity theft, visit ftc.gov/ID theft. That's ftc.gov/ID theft.
Shopping for a car? Applying for a job? Looking for a home? Or just getting your financial house in order? Then it's time to check your credit report. Good news, it's free. The law entitles you to 1 free copy of your credit report from each of the 3 nationwide credit reporting companies every 12 months. Why is it important to check your credit report? It has important information about your financial accounts, how you pay your bills, and if you file for bankruptcy. You want to make sure everything is accurate, especially before you buy a house or a car. or apply for a job. If you notice something wrong, contact the credit reporting company and business providing the information to correct the error. And checking your report can help you guard against identity theft. Visit ftc.gov/ID theft if you spot accounts that aren't yours. How do you order your free credit report? Order online from annualcreditreport.com, the only authorized website for free credit reports, or call 1-877-322-8228. You'll need to provide your name, address, social security number, and date of birth to verify your identity. Keep in mind, you're entitled to one free copy of your credit report every 12 months from each of the 3 nationwide credit reporting companies. So the next time someone asks, "How's your credit?" you'll have the answer. To order your free credit report, visit annualcreditreport.com or call 1-877-322-8228.
And why should you care? Malware, short for malicious software, includes viruses and spyware that get installed on your computer or mobile device without you knowing it. Criminals use malware to steal personal information and commit fraud. For example, they may use malware to steal the login information for your online accounts, or to hijack your computer and use it to send spam. An infected computer can lead to serious problems like identity theft. The good news? There's a lot you can do to protect yourself and your computer. One of the most important steps you can take: install security software from a reliable company and set it to update automatically. The bad guys constantly develop new ways to attack your computer, so your software must be up to date to work. Set your operating system and your web browser to update automatically too. If you're not sure how, use the help function and search for automatic updates. Don't buy security software in response to unexpected calls or messages, especially if they say they scanned your computer and found malware. Scammers send messages like these to trick you into buying worthless software, or worse. Visit onguardonline.gov, the federal government site, to help you stay safe, secure, and responsible online.